Bashar al Assad's path to the presidency was far from preordained, a journey marked by unexpected twists and turns. Born in Damascus in 1965, he was the second son of Hafez al-Assad, Syria's iron-fisted ruler, who held the country in a tight grip for decades. Unlike his older brother Basil, who was groomed for leadership from a young age, Bashar pursued a career in ophthalmology, showing little interest in politics. He studied medicine in Damascus and later specialized in London, seemingly destined for a life outside the cutthroat world of Syrian politics, far removed from his father's authoritarian rule. Fate, however, had other plans. In 1994, Bassel died in a car crash, a tragic event that thrust Bashar into the spotlight as his father's heir apparent, altering his life's trajectory forever. He returned to Syria, enrolling in a crash course in military and political affairs, quickly adapting to the new expectations placed upon him. Bashar rapidly rose through the ranks, gaining control of key security apparatuses and cultivating an image of a modernizer within the aging Ba'ath Party, a party deeply entrenched in the country's political landscape. When Hafez al-Assad died in 2000 after 3 decades in power, Bashar, then just 34, seamlessly assumed the presidency, stepping into his father's formidable shoes. His ascension was met with cautious optimism, both domestically and internationally, as many saw potential for change in the young leader. Many hoped the young, Western-educated doctor would usher in a new era of reform and openness in Syria, breaking away from the oppressive policies of his father's regime. These hopes, however, would soon be dashed against the rocks of the Assad regime's deeply entrenched authoritarianism as the old guard maintained its grip on power. While Bashar initially promised political and economic liberalization, his reforms proved to be shallow and short-lived, failing to bring about the substantial change many had hoped for. Within a few years, the Damascus Spring, as it was optimistically dubbed, had given way to a harsh winter of repression, with the regime clamping down on dissent and stifling any hopes for genuine reform. The early days of Bashar al-Assad's presidency were marked by a palpable sense of anticipation and hope. People across Syria were eager to see what changes the young leader would bring. The country seemed poised for change, with a new era of possibilities on the horizon. Bashar, with his modern outlook and Western education, was seen as a stark contrast to his father's austere and repressive rule. His background gave many Syrians hope for a more open and progressive future. He spoke of reform, openness, and the need to modernize Syria's stagnant economy and political system. His speeches were filled with promises of a brighter future. This period, known as the Damascus Spring, saw a surge in political and intellectual activity. Citizens felt empowered to voice their opinions and engage in public discourse. Salons were abuzz with discussions of democracy and human rights. Political prisoners were released and censorship was relaxed, allowing for a freer exchange of ideas. For a brief moment, it seemed Syria might be on the cusp of a genuine democratic opening. The atmosphere was electric with optimism and the belief that real change was possible. This nascent period of liberalization, however, was not to last. The initial excitement began to wane as the reality of entrenched power structures set in. The old guard of the Ba'ath Party, threatened by these changes, began to push back. They saw the reforms as a direct threat to their long-held power and influence. They feared losing their grip on power and the privileges that came with it. The resistance from within the regime grew stronger. Bashar, caught between his promises of reform and the entrenched interests of the regime, ultimately chose the latter. The pressure from the old guard was too great to overcome. The Damascus Spring was brutally suppressed, censorship was reinstated, and the brief period of openness came to an abrupt end. Political activists were arrested and imprisoned. The hopes and dreams of many Syrians were crushed under the weight of the regime's crackdown. The regime, it seemed, had reverted to its old ways. The brief experiment with liberalization was over, and the country returned to a state of fear and repression. The hopes for a democratic Syria were crushed, paving the way for the unrest and violence that would engulf the country in the years to come. The dream of a reformed Syria was replaced by a nightmare of conflict and suffering. The September 11th attacks on the United States had profound implications for the Middle East, including Syria. The world watched in horror as the Twin Towers fell, and the immediate aftermath saw a global shift in political and military strategies. The attacks ushered in an era of American military interventionism in the region. The US launched operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, aiming to dismantle terrorist networks and topple regimes that were perceived as threats. The Bush administration's war on terror targeted not just al-Qaeda, but also regimes deemed hostile to American interests. This broad approach meant that countries like Syria were suddenly under intense scrutiny. Bashar al Assad, wary of US military power and seeking to avoid the fate of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, initially adopted a pragmatic approach. He understood the need to navigate this new geopolitical landscape carefully. He condemned the 9/11 attacks and offered limited cooperation with the US in its counter-terrorism efforts. This included public statements of solidarity and behind-the-scenes intelligence sharing. This included sharing intelligence on suspected jihadist networks operating in Syria and allowing the CIA to use Syrian territory for its extraordinary rendition program. These actions were meant to show goodwill and avoid direct confrontation. However, Assad also continued to support groups deemed terrorist organizations by the US, such as Hamas and Hezbollah. This dual strategy was risky but aimed at maintaining regional influence. He saw these groups as leverage against Israel and a way to project Syrian influence in the region. Supporting these groups allowed Assad to play a significant role in Middle Eastern geopolitics. This two-pronged approach, balancing cooperation with defiance, characterized Assad's foreign policy in the years following 9/11. It was a delicate balancing act that required constant adjustment. This balancing act became increasingly untenable as the US grew frustrated with Assad's continued support for militant groups. The tension between the two nations escalated. The US imposed sanctions on Syria, accusing the regime of developing weapons of mass destruction and sponsoring terrorism. These sanctions had significant economic and political impacts on Syria. Relations between the two countries plummeted, setting the stage for further confrontation in the years ahead. The post-9/11 world had irrevocably altered the dynamics between the US and Syria, leading to a complex and often adversarial relationship. By the end of the 2000s, Syria was a tinderbox waiting to ignite. Decades of authoritarian rule, economic stagnation, widespread corruption, and systematic human rights abuses had created a deeply fractured and resentful society. The Arab Spring uprisings, which swept across the Middle East and North Africa in early 2011, provided the spark. Inspired by the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, Syrians took to the streets in March 2011, demanding political freedom and economic opportunity. The protests, initially peaceful, were met with brutal force by the Assad regime. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators, killing and injuring hundreds. The regime's violent crackdown further inflamed the situation. Protests escalated, spreading to cities and towns across the country. Armed opposition groups began to emerge, composed of defectors from the Syrian army and ordinary citizens who took up arms to defend themselves and their communities. By the summer of 2011, Syria was engulfed in a full-blown civil war. What began as a peaceful pro-democracy movement had descended into a brutal and complex conflict, pitting the Assad regime against a fragmented opposition, with regional and international powers increasingly drawn into the fray. Russia's intervention in the Syrian conflict marked a significant turning point. In late 2015, Russian forces launched a military campaign in support of President Bashar al Assad. This intervention not only bolstered Assad's regime, but also shifted the balance of power on the ground. The Russian military provided air support, training and advanced weaponry, enabling Assad's forces to reclaim key territories. As a result, Assad's resurgence became evident, with government forces recapturing major cities and strategic locations. This period of intensified conflict saw significant changes in the dynamics of the Syrian war, with Russia playing a pivotal role in shaping the outcome. As the empire grew more vast, internal dissent began to fester. Factions within the court vied for power, shifting alliances became the norm. Trust was a rare commodity, and intrigue was the order of the day. The once unified leadership now found itself fractured, struggling to maintain control. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, the empire faced mounting challenges. Foreign powers sensed the internal turmoil and sought to exploit it. Diplomatic maneuvers became increasingly complex, with every decision carrying the weight of potential disaster. The stakes had never been higher, and the empire's future hung in the balance. Amidst the chaos, a rebel surge gained momentum. Discontented factions united under a common cause, pushing back against the imperial forces. The dynasty, once thought invincible, now faced its greatest threat. The end of an era was at hand as the rebellion's fervor signaled the collapse of a once mighty empire. In the aftermath, the once great empire lay in ruins. The state, now broken, struggled to navigate its new reality. Leaders emerged from the chaos, attempting to rebuild and restore order. The path forward was uncertain, but the resilience of the people offered a glimmer of hope. The journey to recovery had begun, marking the start of a new chapter in the nation's history.